This really became the cornerstone for a lot of the things that we're now doing with really large corporations in the age of artificial intelligence, where expertise is compressed and the real key is thinking through complexity and how do I manage in this environment that's disaggregating very quickly. So that's become a tome for that, how to do that. But it really came out of this experience of how come these really brilliant people who give their blood and treasure their life for the cause, why are they having trouble with this?
If you want to punish somebody, don't punish them for doing the wrong thing. The worst thing is to punish them when they think they've done the right thing. And that just cuts to the very core of what it's like to be an innovator, because that's what happens time and time again.
When you start doing something really innovative, no one will notice. He said after that, they'll tell you that you're doing it wrong. He said after that, they'll call you unprofessional. He said in the end, they'll take credit for your work.
Before we start into the finale of the trilogy with the DeGraffs, I want to thank our sponsor Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find out more about Kyndryl and the Kyndryl Institute at KYNDRYL. Don't forget, if you sign up to the Innovation Show Substack, you can win a copy of The Creative Mindset. But let's get stuck into this book, The Art of Change. Change efforts rarely fail because of poor strategy or execution, but because leaders are using the wrong mindset. They treat change as a project to be managed with fixed goals, linear plans, and measurable outcomes, when change is actually a dynamic, paradoxical process that resists that logic entirely. Our guests argue that organizations are structurally designed to resist change because they exist to eliminate variance and deviance. Change makers therefore collide with the system by definition and often get pushed out, even when they succeed. It is a pleasure to welcome back, for the finale of our DeGraff Trilogy, the authors of The Art of Change, today's book, and the others are there behind me. Jeff and Staney DeGraff, you're very welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having us back.
Thank you.
It's great to have you guys back. I thought we'd start a little bit different because we've come to the finale of our trilogy, and I have the distinct gift here, and I mean a gift from the universe, of reading the books in sequence, kind of like as you'd written them, except it's compressed week after week. So I've seen how the books have compounded on the knowledge that you've collected during the years. I've seen little bits of sprinkles of earlier books appear again. But Jeff, I thought I'd come to you first about this because this book is a little bit different and it reflects the learning you've had and the amount of clients you've worked with in the meantime since you started your very first book.
Yeah, so the whole idea of this was the books were written as a trilogy. And this book was written that really came out of a bunch of discussions with sort of two groups of people. Number one, when I got together with these great thought leaders that I kind of came up under, C.K. Prahlad and Carl Weick and Bob Quinn and Kim Cameron and all these brilliant guys, we never talked about successes. We talked about our failures. And we talked about them as learning opportunities. What did we learn? And these were the kind of projects that people read about, the United Nations or the military or Apple or Google or whatever companies are reading about. But the second thing was we were working on a project at the very highest level for the military, and not just the U.S. military, but militaries around the world. And what occurred to us was these are some of the brightest, most committed people. We love these people. But when it came to highly ambiguous situations, paradoxical situations, their ability to adapt, their ability to think in very different ways was highly constrained. And it's because they'd been trained differently. And we noticed that giving them all these lenses, et cetera, wasn't really landing. What really landed was talking about my own failures of saying, okay, here's what happened when I went to this biotech and it completely failed. And we figured some stuff out eventually, and then it became this very famous company. So the book is about that. The book is kind of being vulnerable and almost like a parable and saying, and at the end of this, the moral of the story is this is how you think about this. So it really connects the idea of change to the idea of adaptability to the idea of learning. These are learning opportunities. And this really became the cornerstone for a lot of the things that we're now doing with really large corporations in the age of artificial intelligence, where expertise is compressed and the real key is thinking through complexity and how do I manage in this environment that's disaggregating very quickly. So that's become a tone for that, how to do that. But it really came out of this experience of how come these really brilliant people who give their blood and treasure their life for the cause, why are they having trouble with this?
I just want to remind our audience, I have a copy, because you're probably wondering why there's 4 books up there. I have a copy of The Change Mindset up there for those of you who sign up to our Substack as well. I've already picked a winner for part 1 and part 2. This is part 3, so there's one more chance, one more bite at the cherry before we finish. But this book is The Art of Change, and at the heart of the book is 2 core things to understand. One is paradox, and the other is the word mindset itself. I thought we'd get them out of the way first, your definitions of what they mean, because they're core to understanding this book.
Paradox is, I think, relatively easy, meaning that 2 ideas that seem to be antithetical, and they appear at the same time. Remember, F. Scott Fitzgerald, the guy who wrote The Great Gatsby, said, the definition of genius is being able to hold 2 oppositional ideas in your mind at the same time. That's what a paradox is. And I would expand the concept of a paradox a little bit to say incongruities, high degrees of ambiguity, right? Things that are nonsensical when you first encounter them, right? And then the idea of mindset is whatever we're calling cognition and inquiry. However your mind makes inquiry, your cognition, if you're a neurobiologist, your neocortex, right? Whatever your listeners believe about mind, how it makes inquiry. And the whole idea of this is we're taught patterns. And patterns are really important because the world would be very complicated or nominal if we didn't think in patterns. But the notion is some of those patterns become so rigid that when we're seeing something, we simply try and destroy it with that pattern. And so there's a whole part to this that I think is another word, which is meaning making or sense making is a key idea here. What are we looking at? What does it mean? And I know Staney has a lot of experience with this, but she was a graduate student, Carl Weick's.
I didn't realize that. Yeah, because Carl Weick is the sense-making guy, really, isn't he? He brought it to prominence. Stanny's nodding away there. I was thinking about this, Stanny. I wrote an article recently, and I called it Being Punished for Doing the Right Thing. And my wife actually said to me, was that about me? Because just for those who may not have caught part 1 and part 2, Jeff and Stanny are married. And they're in separate places at the moment because Jeff is in the university and Stanley's in the office, runs the office. But the point of this article is very relevant for this book, and particularly the opening about this guy, Luis, because I was writing about those innovators, and often so many innovators go out on a limb, they're deviant, they go against the paradigm of the organization, they go against the rules, and they have a breakthrough, and then they're punished for that. And I cannot find for the life of me where I heard this, but I believe that was and I may have just imagined this. I thought it was somebody like Nietzsche who said, if you want to punish somebody, don't punish them for doing the wrong thing. The worst thing is to punish them when they think they've done the right thing. And that just cuts to the very core of what it's like to be an innovator, because that's what happens time and time again. And I thought we'd open and maybe close the entire day today with the story of Luis, because it comes full circle at the end of the book.
I have a sign in my office that said, organizations love innovation but hate their innovators. And it really came from a conversation when I was a very young man with Jonas Salk, probably one of the greatest scientists of the 20th century. And he really let me know what was going to happen. And he famously said to me, when you start doing something really innovative, no one will notice. He said, after that, they'll tell you that you're doing it wrong. He said, after that, they'll call you unprofessional. He said, in the end, they'll take credit for your work, right? no truer words have ever been said. All right. That's been Staney and my experience throughout our career. And this is important for people to know. If you're on the path to be a real innovator, and I'm talking about writing about innovation, remember, we've been in half the Fortune 500 companies. I mean, we're kind of I don't know where, whether we're the Indiana Joneses or the Forrest Gumps of this field. But the notion is we're practitioners, we're academics, right? So we write about things, but that we also build a lot of things. And these are the table stakes. So the book starts with the story of Luis, and we got brought in to look at how to accelerate the transference from radical new technologies into the military. And Luis was the guy who did it. And what happened was they completely sat on the project, as you would have expected. The bureaucracy took over, nothing happened. And this was only about 2 months before COVID hit. COVID hits, and you remember all the world governments sort of completely fumble the ball. They don't know what to do. There are these 2 or 3 different models. None of them are very good. And around April, the United States government decides to create something called Operation Warp Speed, right? Which is now we're going to put some real muscle behind this. And this thing that Luis worked on, which became called Rapid X, was actually co-opted to expedite the process of the vaccine. So not so much to develop the vaccine, but how to get billions of vials and billions of needles and cold chain storage, and how do we get this into people so that we survive this? And he did just a brilliant job, and a very unassuming man behind the scenes, lots of stuff, bringing the right people in, all the stuff we've talked on previous ones. And then when it was over and we had victory, 100, remember the object was 100 million vaccines and 100, and we did it. Yay, us. Luis certainly was one of the key people for this. It came time for him to be promoted, and they passed him over, right? And we've seen this, Staney and I have seen this time and time and time again, right? So the notion was, that's why I wanted to start the book, is to say, even getting it right doesn't mean you'll succeed.
What happened was that then other people started taking credit. And they posted and things and say, well, I was the leader of this or whatever. I created this. And we were there when Luis was getting it off the ground, and we knew the people who were around him and who worked with him. And no, these other people who claimed the credits and were nowhere to be found. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
Even a couple of very popular books that had been on the New York Times bestseller list, we were there, and what they're reporting is a reporting of reporting, and they're incorrect. This is really important to note. These are very established writers who would swear that these are correct. They didn't talk to the right people, right? The whole idea of Luis and this particular part of the military, which became the background. And again, Staney and I were part of all of this only in the supply chain way, and only because we had developed this for technology. We did not develop this for the COVID vaccine, but it's a perfect example of how great technologies also get co-opted, great processes. And remember, we talked about this in a previous one. Innovations and changes do not move from the inside out. They move from the outside in. And what happens is the farther you move to the center, the more ideas become co-opted, right? And I'm not saying this is a bad thing. Watch the movie Oppenheimer. It's a perfect example. Robert Oppenheimer is not quite a Nobel Prize-winning quality thinker, but he knows all the people, and he's a key leader in these ideas. He brings everybody together. He's really smart. But the part of the movie which people get really upset is when they take his clearances. And I'm not sure if I was in that boat, I wouldn't have taken his clearances. Because the people who invent things or build things at some point have to hand off to the people who are going to run them or manage them. The problem in the first chapter of the book, we talk about Luis, isn't that it should have been handed off. It's that they basically said, we invented this when all they really needed to do was tip their cap to Luis.
I've seen that time and time. It's happened to me. I think that's the thing. It's happened most change makers when they've had a success. And I talked about it in a previous episode. One of the hard things I found, my ego found hard, and it depends on the organization you're in, and if they tip the hat towards you, that's a key thing. Just to be the recognition that you went through so many difficulties to get this over the line. And in some cases, the very people who are the biggest blockers are up doing the keynote, doing the presentation, saying, this is what I and my team did. And you're going, you were the biggest blocker.
There's no way around that, though. What I want your listeners to understand, these are table stakes. This, if you're going to be an innovator, a real innovator, not innovation theater, none of this, you're a builder. If you're a real innovator, expect this. And if you want to be loved, get a dog, right? I mean, it's really that simple. You innovate because it's in your soul. You're internally motivated to do it.
It's so difficult, though. I have to say to you, I struggled so hard in the early days, particularly because it was early in my career and you wanted some wins and you wanted some recognition so you could move up in the organization. This line in particular, I pulled a line that I think will cut deep. Sorry about this for opening up any wounds for those people listening. Perhaps you're a change maker driven by profound dissatisfaction with the status quo. You come across as negative, but in reality, you harbor a very positive belief that things can be better. You have good ideas on how to transform your organization, but you have trouble selling them and even bigger challenges trying to get them implemented effectively. I think that, in a nutshell, is such a common issue for so many change makers. And as you say, instead of being considered a gainsayer, you're considered a naysayer, or you pipe up in a meeting and you can visibly see people going, oh, not him again, not the black hat guy once again. That's another problem. Let's call that out. I know we haven't even got into the book yet, but these are things that you just see crop up time and time again, and it can make the change maker feel ostracized, bullied, gaslit.
Yeah, I want to add to that. I'm one of the original people here at the University of Michigan that created the Center for Positive Organizational Scholarship, which is a very important thing. But one of the real early things that I wanted to make very clear was positive doesn't mean happy. It means a sense of destiny. It means a sense of positive that I can get to some place that no one's gotten before. It's not the same as happy, right? If you want the difference between happiness and meaning, happiness and impact. What we're working for is meaningfulness in life, my opinion. And what we're working for is impact. Did we make a difference being here, right? So I think what you're talking about is, I think great change makers, like great innovators, have a deep sense of destiny.
There's a really interesting thing I observed, and it's probably because you quote so many of these people, but actually you knew all these people, like Bob Quinn and Kim Cameron and Mintzberg. We had Henry Mintzberg on the show, by the way. He's still thriving up in Canada, talking about this idea of deliberate versus emergent strategy, etc. But I think this part that you call out, because you saw it firsthand, both of you saw it as scholars, as academics, you saw what had happened inside the fields. And you said traditionally change management has often been treated as an offshoot of project management. Leaders establish fixed targets and employ streamlined processes to reach those objectives. However, true mastery of change requires a different approach, one that prioritizes time as a critical factor, given the inherently ambiguous and ever-evolving nature of crises. I thought we'd speak to that because that was a key point for me to share to our audience, that they may have missed that, because that means that, it's like the Planck principle, that science doesn't advance because somebody has a great idea. It advances one funeral at a time. And the old way of doing things has kind of died out, and people realize this is the new way. And therefore, we get into that new paradigm as a result.
I don't want to get too esoteric here, but most of management theory is based on the concept of structure. And change and innovation is based on the concept of time or process, what we call process philosophy, that there are states in which we're in, right? It's like a child developing. So we think in terms of cycles, we think in terms of states. So current state, desired state, version 1, version 2, version 3, think about thin versions and thick versions that innovators talk about. So there's this real strong component of time that underlies everything. And that's the kind of the key that led to this whole idea of the paradox mindset, the paradox mind cycle. One of the things that Staney and I both do, and I do this with students, and at the beginning of classes at Michigan, particularly the MBAs, it drives them bananas. because they want to have the right answers. And the first slide I show them is the age of answers is over. We have artificial intelligence, it's like GPS or Bluetooth. If you want an answer, press a button and you'll get it. The issue is what you can't do is you can't mobilize or manifest that idea into the world by pressing a button. So the first thing we do is we start with a story. So for example, I would show a story of young people, and young people are hooking up more than anybody. You got to talk to young people the way they do. They're hooking up more. New story, they're hooking up more than any other generation. And then somewhere along the line, someone would just make this weird comment on the story about it's the loneliest generation we've ever seen, including widows and widowers. So we've never seen this in our studies. So you start out by saying, okay, we watch the video. Where's the paradox? And so they start finding paradoxes, right? So they're thinking in real time. They're stirring in real time. They're making it up as they go along. Then the second question is, tell me what it means. Now, this is really important because half the time people solve the wrong problem. That's the difference between project management and change and innovation. The problem isn't fixed. If X marks the spot in the age of artificial intelligence, press a button and you'll get it. It's mathematics, right? It's not morality, it's mathematics. So to me, the hardest part, and this goes back to where Staney's an expert on this, is what does this mean? And you're not allowed to answer it. You're not allowed to say it means this. What you have to do is come up with a whole list of things that this could mean. So you're basically thinking around the problem. And I'm forcing you into plasticity. I'm forcing you to be an adaptive thinker. Then we'd say, okay, what are the guiding principles then that we can derive from this? What can we learn from this? Which is much more like philosophy. But it's not philosophy in a rigid way where I start with a model. We're going to make a model. We're going to make a model that might work or might not work. It's a work in progress. See that time element again? It's a work in progress. And then the next part, which is right out of Carl Weick's playbook. What are the small experiments? How are we going to hedge? How are we going to run a bunch of small experiments, not looking for confirming feedback, but disconfirming feedback, looking for where we're wrong, right? Now, there's an implicit humility into this of saying, I'm assuming that I don't know some things that I need to know. And a lot of this stuff came from our work with biotechs and, radical kind of new technologies, the kind of thing you'd maybe see come on a DARPA or, in Europe, Diana, right? The notion is, if you're really in that mood, there aren't any clear answers. And the key step to all of it is, what does this mean? Which is a learning step.
And we see this in a lot of the projects that we've worked with. The most difficult part is to get people to understand that everything can change. It's not just one thing or two things or whatever. So when you're a change maker, you make a plan, right? The plan itself can change, right? I mean, the goal of the plan might change. We might not want to do A, you actually want to do B. The time itself must change. Everything must change. And I think a lot of people just kind of think you can make a plan from A to B, and then you can just kind of figure out a way to get there, and that way might change. But it isn't just that. I mean, your destination might change.
I think readers of this book, I'm getting feedback from a lot of different people. There seems to be kind of the more general readership, and then the people who are really, really insightful of this. I'm getting a lot of emails from them. What this book is saying is that the paradox is not part of change. It is the change. The central thesis of the book is that what change basically is about is not resolving the paradoxes, but diving into them. And the notion is a lot of what we do for change goes all the way around these paradoxes, and we never get change from them, right? And it doesn't mean that these paradoxes are going to be resolved. This is the process piece. The notion is these paradoxes occur in antiquity. They'll occur in the future. They're just common paradoxes. But you have to work through those paradoxes, which are unresolved, to come up with experiments that at least move you forward on trying to make the positive change that you're trying to make happen.
Let's bring it to life with there's multiple episodes in the book of experiencing this, but one that many people might relate to, which is a married couple, Aaron and Olive, and an all too familiar tale.
I'm going to let Staney take that.
Go ahead, Olive. Go ahead, Olive.
That one is actually it's more of the easier ones. That is, you can actually kind of solve that, right? I mean, two people have two different goals. And then because they have two different views of how to, in this case, finances, right?
Stanley, can I add a bit of context
Yes.
just to give the background here? So Olive and Aaron. Aaron, I think, is he comes from a background where finances are tight. So everything needs to clear the debt. Don't borrow too much, etc. While Olive comes from a more wealthy background, and I may have them the wrong way around, but
No,
Olive's
right.
like more, let's invest, let's put it in high risk investments because there's a bigger return from that. So that's the setup, because I think that's an important thing just to call out, that it's that. And also, we talked about this before, the embracing of the difference is where the beauty comes from. And we talked about this with the innovation code, that there's beauty in that diversity, that neurodiversity, if you harness it like you're going to tell us about here.
Yeah. So in that example, you're right. So Aaron's is a lot more conservative in terms of what you do with the money, and Olive knows that in order for you to make money, you actually have to invest more, right? I think it just kind of shows there are ways in the middle on how to do things that can combine both interests and so forth, because both things is true.
The point of the story is kind of two parts to it. Number one, it's not about compromise. The first part of the story is we're constantly rebalancing our portfolio life, constantly. What worked for you? Imagine if you got everything you wanted the day you graduated from high school. It'd be a disaster, right? So we're constantly rebalancing our lives. And these dynamics change that. And they're changed often from not just personal aspirations, but from outside. There's a recession, there's a war, something happens to, right? So and so. But the second part of this was that it wasn't just rebalancing, it was finding hybrids. It was finding things that met both criteria, so that got the benefit of both pieces, not just, and so it's not a compromise. It's trying to find something that's beneficial, right? But I think the key part of the thing that we're talking about is that the change changes with the change, right? And which is part of what we talked about it originally with Luis, that the whole use of this technology this process we developed changed because something changed, and there's a ton of examples historically. Think about Alexander Fleming, what he's trying to do at Oxford, and he's trying to solve certain types of things, and a mold falls on his petri dish while he's on vacation. The next thing he realizes it's killing bacteria, and we have penicillin, and so now it's going in a different direction. And this is very common. And so, again, the difference in project management would be say, well, no, we're trying to accomplish this. And there's got to be a part to this where somebody goes, wait a minute, there's something else going on here. And I need to be adaptive at that point and course correct. There's something that's maybe more valuable out of this. And of course, we can give hundreds of examples of this. But to Stanley's point, this happens at both the level of just individuals, right? And it happens at higher levels. We try and minimize conflict, but change is created by conflict. If you really want to see an organization it's not going to change, not going to invent anything, what you really want to look for is a lot of alignment and apathy. Everyone's happy, right? And I give an example in the book of coming to one of the largest organizations in the world and going in the elevator and listening to Led Zeppelin music and seeing J.W. Turner paintings on the wall, and everyone was nice and it was great, and then you become the black hat guy of going, you brought me in here to make an eviction happen. You guys are way too you're way too calm, and everything is way too aligned and apathetic for anything to grow here, and you really have to work to say, what are the issues here? And you have to pull them out. And then finally, it's like functional versus dysfunctional families. Dysfunctional families never have the argument, and then there's divorce, right? And dysfunctional families are having the argument in a dysfunctional way, and then there's divorce. Functional, everybody who's ever been married for a long time knows there's going to be a dust up, right? There's going to be some chippiness, right? Whatever you want to call it in whatever part of the world you're at. But within boundaries, within that, we're trying to do the same thing. We're trying to get ahead. So I think that becomes really kind of the key to this is, do we have enough generative energy to get to the next place?
It's such an important thing, Jeff. I was thinking before when I was reading the first book, The Innovation Code. And by the way, it's not the first book of what you've written. It's the first of the trilogy. I just want to tell our audience that there are other books that we didn't cover. But I was thinking about my son. So my son had this horrific teacher. She was terrible. His first teacher. And she had this rule. We speak Gaelic. We're taught Gaelic, Gaelga. It's called Irish language here. And white spots is sputty bána, right? And she would say, you're not allowed to have any sputty bána. So when they were colouring in, they weren't allowed to leave white spots. And she must have given out to them or scared them in some way. Fast forward to, I'm colouring with him. He's only, he's 4 or 5. And he's done, you colour mine for me. He was scared to colour in case he left the white spots, right? So I was thinking about this, like, firstly, that teacher, I was angry with her. But apart from that, I was thinking about, well, sometimes you start the lens or the paradigm for that person, even in childhood like that don't make mistakes. Or like you said, another time when inevitably you have an argument at home with your partner or your wife, or whoever. Anytime I say to the boys, my 2 sons, I say, it's normal to fight. Otherwise, you just hold it up and then something worse happens down the line. And I want them to know that conflict is important because you disagree on something. And I'll tell them about the point of disagreement. And then last part on this, I'm sometimes brought into organizations. I run a program called Communicate to Innovate. And I'm talking to this team, and I'm brought in specifically because people won't call out the elephant in the room, but they'll talk about each other behind their backs, right? And not purposefully, my fly is down. For the first hour, my zipper's down. I'm flying low. No one says it to me. And then an hour passes, and a guy kind of says, we're having a coffee break, and he says, hey, man, I don't know if this is part of your gig here, man. Your fly is down. And then I was like, why did none of you say it to me? They're like, oh, we weren't sure. We didn't want to upset you. And I was like, going, that's the point here. You should have told me straight away. But I wanted to then bring it to the book because leaning into that, and if you don't lean into it, and also if you don't have the culture that allows for it, you miss things. And a great example you give in the book, and I learned about this only recently looking at Nokia. I know you're the Nokian scholar, was Timo Partanen, a guy who teaches up in Adelphi University. I mentioned him before. He told me that Nokia had this music service where you could actually get free music for Nokia. And the whole idea, it was like, think about it, 20 years before Spotify, they had Spotify. You downloaded the music. You had unlimited music amounts to download. But nobody saw that this actually could be a different service that they could sell. Instead, they used it to do what they always do, to sell more phones. And it came to mind when I read about your work with the car manufacturer, when they had this beautiful concept sitting right in front of them of mobility. And because of the deliberate strategy, because they're aiming for that strategy, they missed the emergent right under their nose. Maybe you'll share this one.
Well, I don't want to say what the car manufacturer is. I'm still on good terms with them. But I used to be part of running the board meetings. And I'd fly to Europe to do it, right? And one board meeting, we were looking at growth and profitability, and they're amazing engineers. I just cannot say enough good. I mean, really amazing people. And they ran a project in London. They ran a project in Germany. And the projects had to do with ride sharing. And they were extremely successful and profitable. And so the question came up about, well, why aren't we thinking about transportation this way? And then the issue became, well, that will cut into sales of this stuff. And I have a million of these around this kind of industry. I mean, if you think about where the electronic vehicle came from, it did not come from where most people think it came from. The electronic vehicle, you look it up, the EV1 came from General Motors, right? 89, 90, early, right? There's a ton of these where, and they're famous. Kodak got to digital imaging first, and Blockbuster got to streaming. I know that because I worked on Hulu, which, got there first, right? For our friends at General Electric. So there's a ton of these where somebody gets it, but because it doesn't fit their model. And the most prominent example here in the United States is Sears. And people tell the Sears stories all wrong. Remember, think about this for just a minute if your listeners are willing to do this. Think about how the digital economy started. So Sears, Sears had Allstate, which began bundling. It had Coldwell Banker, real estate. It had everything. It created the digital economy. People forget this, and you should look it up. I wrote an article on Big Think around this, right? No, Inc. magazine. I wrote for Inc. But the point is, they had all the pieces, and it's the wrong story. People get it wrong. Sears missed. They didn't miss anything. The problem was they tried to fit it all into their store, right? And that's the problem that this book is really trying to address, is saying a lot of times this is not an issue of working harder or doing something new or better. It's an issue of looking at this differently. Remember, this car company had done this already. The only issue was they didn't recognize that they had discovered the future, and it really cost them.
There's so many cases of that, Jeff, though, right? And I was thinking about the character you call out in there. I'm sure he's anonymized, but you call it the guy who was leading that project, and he could see there was something in it. But going back to a Luis type character, he presents that in his career suicide. Somebody told me recently that CIO, Chief Innovation Officer, actually stands for career is over as soon as you take the job. And that's not funny, because actually it is the case in so many organizations, particularly if you choose the future. And I was telling you before, I met with two of the innovation community here in Ireland. Hello, Karen and Anne-Marie. I'll say hello to them because I told them specifically to listen to this series. But we were talking about two things. One was what you said, and you talk about this in the book, and the science and the neuroscience behind this, that if you learn something and you don't immediately apply it, just like any habit, it will fade because it's habit change. And I think that's what's really nice that you do in the book, and why you structure the book the way you do. It actually should be read much slower than I read it, because I read it for the purpose of this interview. But if you read it and you put it into practice, it's kind of like, I give you a great example. Physio. You go to the physio goes, you need to do this rehab, and you don't do it that day or the next day. You forget it, and you're like looking up. Now you have YouTube, luckily, but it fades and you don't ever do it properly. And we see this so many times with change theater that you call out in the book, that you have a big event, you're brought in, the speaker's brought in, you, me, whoever is brought in as the keynote speaker. You can spot it a mile away. There's a big event. There's loads of energy for like a day or two, and then it fades and everybody goes back to business as usual. And what I like about you do in the book is you encourage people to get it straight to practice, do something, small experiments, like you said, etc. I think we should probably call that out, because it's a core part of the whole concept.
I was just brought in the other day to two governments are trying to make a deal. I'll leave it at that. This is pretty high stakes kind of conversation. And the first question I asked was, when they start trying to put together these groups that are going to innovate across boundaries, borders, right, was who's actually built something here? Who's got a lot of experience with this? And the challenge was there were people who had a lot of experience, but they were the junior people. And there were a lot of senior people who were administrators. Administrators are fine. We need administrators. But my point to the administrators was, you don't have this experience. You have to be a guardian, an enabler, helper to those people. Stop telling them what to do, because you don't know what to do. And I see this, universities do this all the time, where the person who gets appointed to be that person is not the innovator, and they're not always pro-innovation, which is very frustrating. I know when I get into these big organizations, I would say at least half the time, the person who's most threatened by me is the chief innovation officer, even though I'm there to help them. I don't want your job. I'm just here to help you get this right side up. And the reason for that is a lot of and again, I'm not saying this is everywhere, but what I find is that often becomes a position like somebody who couldn't make it as the chief operating officer, right? It's often the also ran position, but it's also often a bureaucratic position, my opinion. And often under them are the real innovators, the people who are builders. I'll give you a great example. When I look at the military, the most amazing people I've met are tech sergeants. They have to be. There's a ton of stuff they got to figure out in real time, and they're stunningly good all across the globe. All these different cultures, they have great tech sergeants, right? The issue is a lot of times the people above them don't have those same kind of dirt under the fingernails experiences. Remember, innovation and change is not something you can do on a blackboard or on a PowerPoint slide. You have to have gone through it. That's why this book is about stories. That's why this book is about parables. And most of the stories in this book are about my failures. I couldn't do this, and they don't all win. I love the story in the book where I talk about one of the largest food organizations I got brought into. And I knew exactly what was wrong, and I knew exactly how to fix it, and I was a jerk, right? Even though I knew what was wrong, and I knew how to fix it, and I was brought in by the top dog, my view of this was, you guys aren't getting it. You're the slow group here. So the learning doesn't always be, and then we won. So the learning in that one was, it's very clear as I'm walking out the door, I probably needed to be a different kind of person here, right? So it's not always that kind of abstract.
On that idea of you have skin, you have dirt under your fingernails. A great story. You probably know him, Gary Klein. I had him on the show recently. So you're nodding. So Gary told me this brilliant story about Napoleon, where there was a part of France, Toulon, that was the enemy had taken Toulon, and Toulon had this core, it had resources, it was important. But Napoleon worked as an artillery sergeant, so he had dirt under his fingernails. And his commanding sergeant was attacking the port head on with cannons, etc. And Napoleon's staring over and he's going, "Why are you all attacking the port? All you have to do is take out that small little tower over there that's on a hill because they won't have any supplies." And, it's like that thing of the cavemen with the round, somebody has a wheel and they're pushing along the square wheels. It's like, we're too busy. They're like, shut up with your crazy ideas, because he was a junior officer. And eventually his boss gets fired. He takes out the hill and they capture Toulon again, core battle. But that thing you said, I'd love to double click on that, where you have knowledge and your superior blocks you, or in many cases gets rid of you from the organization because they see you as a threat because you know more than they do. 100% happened to me, and it's why I'm here doing the show. In the organization where I started this innovation show, where I worked for the national broadcaster, I essentially got fired by my boss. Now, the organization tried to save me, but I was like, I'm out of here. But it was because time and time again, and you don't mean this. I didn't mean this. I would say stuff in a meeting where I was asked my opinion, and my boss is kind of going like this, head in her hand, kind of like going, I should have been the one who said that. And I'm sure Stanley's nodding there. You two have seen this because you've worked with so many different organizations across the world, time and time again. And you see the moment as well, and you glance over and you go, oh, I saw what happened there, even though there was no words shared.
I think it's all about the culture and what you project, right? What's within the boundaries and what's not, and what's cultivated. And actually, this is why I told Jeff, just don't go to the faculty meeting anymore. Just don't. It's not useful. It just makes you angry because it just creates bad energy. But again, I mean, this is all about, if the leaders of the organization make it clear that they appreciate, opinions, and they appreciate great ideas, as long as, people are respectful, I think it would be different. And it's difficult to do that. But difficult as a leader to be mindful of this, right? Because you're saying your boss's boss, he should have be able to see it, but he has so many other responsibilities. Even if he made it known that, he wants great ideas, it doesn't always happen. He can't see what everybody does. So part of, I think what's also difficult is, as a leader, you have to be able to spot talent. And I think that's hard, but I think that's the key. It's the people. You're not looking for a particular thing. To me, it's like, if you find the right people I think that's the key.
When we go home to Indonesia, to Staney's house, where she was raised, I like to look through her elementary school reviews.
Hope there's no white spots there, no white spots in our coloring.
Staney's really smart. And the good news is top of the class, all this in very competitive environment, right? All this stuff. But in every review, she's disruptive. Right. And I just think that, to me, I love that part, because if she wasn't disruptive, she wouldn't do this. So what I find is that people who kind of ascended to the part where they're kind of very successful innovators, they have a long history of being reviewed as not disruptive in a negative way, but disruptive, right? And then people will use that word with it. So I want to go back to your son, right? If your son would have had a different response to his teacher, he would have been deemed disruptive. Now, here's the point. The point is, what happens with innovation is those people have been disruptive, and if they've gone through the failure cycle a lot, gotten fired, been marginalized, whatever, when it comes time to go through the failure cycle, remember, that's one of the things. We try to avoid failure, but in innovation and change, there's no avoiding failure. You have to go through the failure cycle. We're more comfortable. We're more comfortable calling us dummy, or we got it wrong, or whatever you want to call us. We're comfortable because we've taken our beating, right? Whatever you want to call it. It's the people who have had effortless superiority that they completely fail. And one of the things I want to say about the way we're raising our kids these days, I'm very worried about it. I think there's two kinds of parenting. There's the don't do that parent. And then there's, like my dad, hurt, didn't it? Don't rub it again home, you dumbass, right? The notion is the only time you say don't do that is if Junior's going to play on the freeway or he's something that's really dangerous, right? But most of the time, you have to let people go through not major failures, but minor failures, right? One of the things I'm very thankful for is my mentors were very much take a whack at it. And they weren't all nice. I want to say this to your listeners. They loved me in the way that maybe a coach would love you. You can run faster, you can jump higher, you're stronger than that. I think I'd expect more out of you than that. But so it doesn't mean that they didn't love me. It just means that they were very much, you have to figure this out. You're going to have a lot of fun staying up all night the next 2 nights sorting this thing out, Junior. So I think there's something about that. And one of the things that Staney's really been great at, she kind of has this entourage of the Innovatrium. She's had all of these kind of, I'm going to call them disciples or whatever. She's attracted a lot of particularly young women who just think they want to be her. But one of the things she lets them do is go through the failure cycle, not in a negative way. She'll say, here's a project. I'll see you next week about the project. And then, they're all looking for, is it all great? And it's like, a lot of it's good, but there's some things here that we need to, and you didn't swim out far enough. You didn't try enough here.
I think, again, it's about knowing what the stakes are and where the boundaries are, right? There has to be a hard boundary on something. So, for example, you can't go to the freeway. That's whatever it is. But everything else is totally fine. And I think we mentioned this before too, is that innovation and creativity actually works really well when there's very clear boundaries. And I think as educator, for example, like your son's teacher, it's like, what matters? I mean, does no white spot, does that actually matter in life, right? I mean, to me, of course not, but obviously for it is. But it's all like that. I was just remembering actually when Jeb was talking, children, and I think because I come from the philosophy that actually children really need to find time to play, and that's how they learn, right? And you can't really structure all their days that they have to be at school for 8 hours, and then they have this, and they have that, and they have that, and they have that all the way until they go to bed. I don't think that's healthy, because I think everybody needs to have unstructured time in which they can do something out of their curiosity that can do something for them, that invokes some feelings to them, and that may let them make meanings in something. So with actually the fellows that I work with, I don't give them a lot of directions in terms of how to do something. I give them a job that is Your job is to do this. So the final goal is I want this organized. I don't actually care how you organize them. You just need to tell me. And if I don't agree with that, I will tell you. But I need you to come to me first and tell me how you're going to organize it. I'm not going to tell you how. And some people don't like that approach, obviously, right? Because I can't show them how to do something. Because they have to go out and try to kind of figure out how to do it themselves. And that's hard. But unless you do that, you're not going to be able to grow.
I have a good example of this. The first innovator we built across the street from the business school here. And we basically gave keys to the coolest people we knew, professors, and said, well, all you're going to do is bring your young people here. We're not switching you old guys, young people. And everything that happens here has to be about change, creativity, or innovation. And we want big things. We're not going to work on little dinky things. We're going to work on big things. And a lot of the student groups got formed there, and we became the hot spot. Well, what happens is, over time, the university watches this for 10 years. And it's not just this university. They all do this. Then they'll build a big center somewhere, and they'll appoint a person, have a nice big hat or something at the person. And it'll be all very organized, but the stuff the sort of the more radical stuff stops happening. And it stops happening because you're now don't do that. Whereas in the first group, it was, this is your play space. It's your tree fort. You figure out what's going to happen here. There's a few rules, here's the legal rules, and here's a couple of, socially accepted, it's only a handful of things you're not allowed to do, right? But the notion was, what organizations love to do is they build these things. So I was just recently part of this big think tanky thing about workplace design. And we're going through all the great things in workplace design. And I asked all these architects, are you designing places for people to hide? And they said, what? And I said, places for people to hide. And they said, what do you mean places people hide? I said, change innovation doesn't start where everyone can see it. You have to hide. I said, right now they're hiding in the coffee shop or the pub. They're hiding right now. And they're already talking trash, and they're figuring out what the next, the next revolution will be broadcast or whatever. And I said, in these organizations, have you placed this? And then this one guy got up, who's an architect. He said, this is blowing my mind. And I said, why? And he said, we had a building like that called ATS. And I said, what does it stand for? He said, across the street. I'm like, yeah, there you go. Right? ATS is across the street. You called the building ATS. It's where. So this, again, want to make sure that everybody's clear about this. So this is a paradox. This is what I'm talking about. So in order for an organization to really innovate, it has to move innovation outside, or change. It has to move it outside the organization where it can get traction, where it can work out all the things that, off Broadway didn't clip the, things didn't work out, to bring it back into the organization.
Some people are more attracted to that kind of environment, right? So, for example, some students group really flourish in which the way we do things. Some people are not. You just kind of know that what approach brings what result. And you can expect that you have like the 12-step programs or a lot of rules to end up having breakthrough products somewhere, because it just doesn't happen that way. You need a lot more space. You need a lot more play. And this is where I think I talked about before too. I feel like the education system we have really actually constrain that, instead of letting the kids find things, and it just constrains them more and more.
It's also very much this whole concept that it's all rational, which it's not. We talk about this in maybe at some point we should talk about what the 7 paradoxes are. But one of the paradoxes is, we use facts to change minds, but facts don't change minds. My favorite example historically comes from Abraham Lincoln. I mean, we had all this stuff in the United States, and this little woman in Connecticut, Harriet Beecher Stowe, wrote this book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a story. It's very melodramatic. It's not even really well written. But the notion is, it took something that was abstract or fact-based, and it made it emotive. And it made it something that people could relate to. People have children. People have a piety for their neighbors and for, and, there are higher order things that we have in life that we believe about ourselves. And the book basically called them to task, right? It wasn't using facts. Remember, Lincoln said, "You're the little lady that started all this problem," right? It wasn't facts that changed the laws. It was somebody who understood that facts don't change minds, and they told a story about this. And the part of these kind of spaces where people do this is they start making their own stories. They're not your stories, they're their stories about how they created this thing in there and how this student group did that. And that's when you know it's working, because now the stories perpetuate itself. And that's just how, incidentally, this is how organizations become dynastic, right? This is how organizations, generation after generation understand what that is. I know when I first got to the University of Michigan, I said something which I was really called to heel on. I said, Michigan is the only school in the world in the top 10 in all 19 areas. We're not number one at anything. We're number 5 at everything. And so it's not true. And they started looking into it, and it was true. Then you started seeing it on T-shirts. It's hilarious, right? And what's happening is that becomes part of the mythology. The story becomes part of the mythology of, Big Blue. What does it mean to be in a big public? And I see this at small schools now. They do a great job with this. Little schools do this. So you don't have to be big. But the notion is it's that paradox that makes something clear often is using something that doesn't make things clear.
Again, that's building culture. And that takes a long time. And that takes a lot of, different artifacts. And actually, you have to be deliberate about it. And goes back again about your story, Aidan, about, the leadership of that organization. If they can somehow instill that culture, that's what you want. It's hard. It takes forever.
That's part of why you're doing, I think, Aidan, what you're doing. If I may be bold enough, you've applied what you did as an athlete to other aspects of your life. I did it too, right? Because those experiences were transferable skills, and you kept then building on transferable skills, you had the ability to do this. Every athlete, and I was everything wrestler, right? And even with that, you're going to get beat. You get beat. And I tell this to people all the time. I don't remember any of the victories. I go home and people, your pictures on the wall or whatever at your high school, and they remember the victories. I don't remember them. I remember every loss I've ever had. I remember why I lost. I don't know if this makes sense to you, but it's that learning from losing, right? That's a failure cycle that gets you to the next place.
I think that there's a great curse in early success. Like if you're successful too early without the struggle of the success, you learn you don't learn anything actually, and you actually don't learn the discipline of what it takes to actually be long-term successful, because that's the transferable skill, is the discipline to keep showing up, the perseverance that you talk about in the book. There's so many places that my mind has gone, by the way, because of the conversation. We will get to the 7 paradoxes. One that Staney kind of identified there is the idea, we talked about it before, that you need some type of boundary in order to succeed. And a beautiful story, I just wanted to share with this. I don't know where I heard it again, because I hear some great knowledge. Somebody was saying to me that, when a young, and they said particularly a young woman, when a girl is with their mother in the swimming pool, it's kind of like in life, it's like a swimming pool. And you are the side where they hang on the side, and then they'll go out and they'll swim out into the middle, to the deep end a little bit. And then if something happens there, they'll come back to you. But if they're with you too long, they'll kind of rebel against you, and they're kind of going, I hate you. And they go back to the center again. And I actually was thinking, because of what you said about the across the street story, that in a way, what an organization is creating is the bell curve. It's the edges. It has to have a place where the edges exist in order to then bring it back to the middle. And like you said, Jeff, there about the story, you're letting them create a story. And in a way, what the innovator does, this is just kind of coming to me at the moment, is you're giving them the ingredients and the plot for the story, but let them own it. And that's the difficulty of giving over the credit, because when you've done that, you've won. But and I often talk about this, the concept of a catalyst is beautiful for this, because a catalyst, like a match, actually gets burnt up in the transaction and you can't see it. I was like, that's the problem of being a catalyst. You're no longer visible at the end, but the fire is taken off, or the wildfire is taken off. And therein is a huge difficulty. So there's many paradoxes in the book. Let's talk to them at a high level, share the 7, and then we'll let people read the book, because you really do need to read the book, add in the stories that you share from your own career, and actually then apply it to yourself and go, well, this is where this is played out for me, etc. And you start to see that, you start to apply it, and in there is the learning. So maybe at a high level, we'll share all 7.
Okay, so I'm cribbing here from my notes, right? So the first one is, we seek to change others, but can only change ourselves, which is the classic. And I start with a story about a girl I dated in college named Katie. When I was training for his wrestling, and she was a chain smoker, right? And the rest of the story is why she dumped me, why she eventually quit smoking, and what I learned from it. I think a more modern example would be like Mother Teresa, who, would take people in and say, change yourself, and then we'll start changing the widows of Mumbai, right? That sort of thing. You can only change you, and you can model that for other people. The second one is, we aspire to transcend our own limits, but must do so from within them. I tell students something that makes them crazy. They'll come in and talk to me about what they want to do, and I'll say, I'm not interested in that. And they get really upset. I said, I'm deeply interested in what you're designed to do. And what you're designed to do is different than what you want to do. What are your gifts? It's freeing. It's not limiting. It's saying, how do I use what I have to do this? My favorite example, one of my heroes, is Beethoven. I mean, imagine writing the 9th when you're deaf. I don't know about you, but that's such a mic dropping thing. I mean, it's like out of all the things it's like Michelangelo doing Michael when he's blind. I mean, it's just that kind of a thing where if it's Beethoven kind of figured out, this is what I got. This is what, don't get me wrong, you can get better, but I think people spend too much time on trying to be good at things they're not naturally good at. I think, again, this is maybe my view of the world, whatever you believe about how you got your gifts, biological or God or whatever you believe about them. You have gifts. And I think you have to be aware of your voice. You have to be aware of, am I a morning creative people, an afternoon creative people, around people, alone, listening to me, right? Once you start figuring out the instrument, I think all of a sudden you understand that this can be used effectively to make great changes, but it cannot be transcended, right? And I think today we try too much to do that. I think that's stuff and nonsense. We already talked about, we use facts to change minds, but minds aren't changed by facts. If you don't believe that, just get on your social media account and try and explain to somebody why their position on something doesn't make sense. And it doesn't have to be politics or religion. It could be GMOs or anything else. And, I give some examples in the books of really good people who, and of course, with social media, we never encounter the loyal opposition. Anybody that disagrees with us, on a dark night on a dark road, they go away. The Spanish Inquisition couldn't have thought of this. I mean, it's that sort of a thing. We set goals for change, but the goals change with change. We already talked about this. This is the problem. This is the difference between project management and change management. Project management is not change management. And if you've had Henry Mintzberg on, watch the Mintzberg thing, right? Strategic thinking versus strategy, strategic planning. Mintzberg got there in front of me, tipped my hat to Henry, right? Great guy. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants, and he certainly is one. I'm a huge fan. You should know I'm a huge fan of Mintzberg. We try to minimize conflict, but change is created by it. This is the center of Staney and our work for 30 some years. That we have to be, this is where society has failed. We have destructive conflict. We're trying to win things as opposed to constructive conflict. Imagine, so I got to give the TED Talk when the Affordable Care Act was rolled out. It was supposed to be originally at the White House. It ended up being at Lincoln Center. The Kennedy Center. But what was interesting was there were two groups. There were the people who wanted government regulation and the people who wanted free markets. And my big thing was, imagine if these two, which they spent $500 billion lobbying. Imagine if we could have taken this energy to build something new. So we brought together the heads of innovation at Apple and Google and some other places. And we talked about things. And I think what really stunned the doctors and what stunned the politicians was to say, we're innovators and change makers. And whether you're involved or not, we're going to do this. And you're just going to be a sideshow. You're going to be road pizza if you're not careful here, right? We know we're coming. And we're not doctors, and we know that. And we need doctors, and we need people in the government to do this. But if you guys aren't willing to engage in the conflict in a constructive way, then we'll show you how to do it, right? And the good news, or there's still bad news about that. The healthcare issue is still an albatross. But certainly when you see alternative forms of what's happening around the world, particularly places like India, stunningly, the progress is amazing. We attempt to avoid failure, but all learning is connected to failure. And of course, the most famous person for this is just go back to Edison. Edison, the 10,000 attempts or shots on goal, and eventually gets the light bulb. And, and anybody who's ever built anything will tell you. And writing is the same way. I was talking about AI the other day, and I think Staney and I were talking about this. You write something, you go to AI, it's still iterative. You still have to go through version, on version 12, it's ready to go, and the AI's not writing for you. You're writing, but you're trying to get disconfirming feedback, and you're moving it forward till it's something that makes sense. And then finally, we endeavor to align change, but change is driven by deviance. And I want to come back to something John Cotter writes about. And I'm not on the same page as John on a lot of stuff, but I'm really on the same page on this for this part. That at the end, it has to be unified, but not at the beginning. So think of it like a funnel, right? And the problem with conventional tools for change and innovation, stage gating systems, portfolio management, KPI, go down the list. They're all starting at the aft position as the output of this, not the inputs. The inputs are culture and competencies and communities and leadership and what's going on in the world and emerging. That's the input. That's the stuff you put in the machine. Only at the end do you align. So the biggest problem is when you see people like venture capitalists try and align things at the front end of this because they're trying to mitigate risk. It doesn't work that way. And I come back to the beginning of the book, the COVID vaccine. 500 shots on goal. Actually, started with 600, but they eliminated 100 just because they were crazy. 169 phase 2, 9 provisional therapies. He took a 10-year process, did it in 6 months. Right. So the notion is, yes, you align, but at the end, not at the beginning. Right. So the paradox is you don't want to have things that are that are crazy, but in order to get what you need, you got to get crazy. Those are the 7.
Love it.
And it could have been 70, but those were the 7 we thought were the biggest.
One of the things I think is so important, and just to reiterate in a slightly different way, Paul Nunes, I don't know if you know Paul, you're nodding, Paul, great guy. He's not far from me. He's in Boston. I met him there just before Christmas, but he said to me that, like, at the start, or at the point of the life cycle, at the point of creative destruction on the S-curve that we talked about in part 1, that you want deviance there, you want disagreement, but when you're in execution mode, you want alignment. And I thought that was interesting because many innovators actually thrive when it's deviance time, but they forget that it'll always get to the alignment time, and they get bored in that time and they want to leave, or it's not the same organization.
That's fine. I think the big thing, and we talked about this in the first video, which is the key learning, is the handoff is the critical part. You need the handoff. So going back to the very first one, the greens or the create people are going to be attracted to risk, to variance, to ambiguity. The middling positions, the sage and the athlete, right? Those positions are antithetical. They'll take much longer than you think they're going to take. There's natural tension between getting the right people on board and selling to the right people and making sure the project is on track and making money, which is what VCs want or private equity wants or your company wants if it's got an incubator. That's the long part, and that's where most changes die and innovations die because it takes too long. You're in the desert. Yeah, if it really was that easy, it would have been done through standard operating procedure. This is where all the big talk ends. Oh, you're a big talker. Now, can we get through this desert here? What do they call Moore called it the bottom of the bathtub or Death Valley, right? Us old timers, we have names for all this crap. And then the aft position is you got to get scale, which is what you're saying. At the aft position, it's like, okay, we've agreed to this, Now we got to get processed and a lot of complexity, and we're going to spend a lot of money. We got to push our chips in the middle of the table. So the key is that even though these are antithetical, how we hand off as human beings. And the problem with most change and innovation processes is they don't take this into account. What they say is, this is the way to do it. Here are the 8 steps. And that's not how it works.
And it's not just changing processes. I mean, we're talking about, for example, even in teams, these interactions in teams, throughout the life of the projects, right? I mean, who the leader is or who you listen to is different from stage to stage to stage. So like you said, I think that all the Greens in the beginning, they come out with all the radical ideas, which is really great. And then they get bored, right? And all the way until the end. But this is the thing. Even during that last part, the Greens still need to be there because they are the weather vane. And the organization needs to understand that it's the Greens' job to say, wait a minute, there's a disconfirming feedback. This may not work anymore. Or our approach was wrong. And if there isn't that person, you're going to create something that it's not useful.
Conflict. We need constructive conflict. And at the heart of this are diverse worldviews. And those come from experience. That you have different views. And I hope this is making sense. We come right back to the first principles at the beginning of this. Hey, let's go back to Luis. Let's finish with Luis. Had Luis had the kind of commanding officer that would have made sense. Luis's commanding officer would have said, Luis is really good at this particular type of job. The openings are these kinds of jobs. And he would have looked for an alternative for Luis to keep Luis in the military, to keep him warm, and maybe to give him some additional projects that he could have worked on that he probably would have been very happy with, right? Instead, they lost all of this experience and knowledge of developing a COVID vaccine.
I think the military is a little different. They have a very strong and rigid career path and, what they need to do. I think in the industry, we have a lot more freedom as a supervisor, as a manager, to kind of create new positions or things like that.
I want everybody to remember that everybody doesn't want the same thing, right? If you're in the forward position, if you're create, you want freedom. I know it's a big thing for me. Think about who builds a shop across the street. That's crazy, right? If you're the opposite, if you're an engineer, you want more responsibility, right? You seek responsibility, advancement. If you're an athlete, you seek goal attainment, money, right? Whatever. And if you're a sage, what you seek is harmony. You want to work in a place that's harmonious. And these are all important parts of innovation and change and worthwhile and good, but they're different.
You mentioned Geoffrey Moore there. We have a series with Geoffrey Moore coming down the line as well. At least 8 parts covering his books as well. The More of More series. So we're going to get through all the legends. One thing I just thought we'd put in there before we finish, really just to fly through it, a bit of homework for our audience, which is the paradoxical mindset cycle, the 4 steps. And maybe you'll just say, this is how you do it. And because you do this in the book where each chapter gives, so you start off by giving the paradoxes, then you take us through it, you give us an example, and then you go, okay, it's over to you now using this cycle.
Yeah, I'll tell you a real story that will make this clear to your listeners. So I love trees, and Staney and I live on the river, and it's like Hobbiton. There are trees everywhere, right? We live around trees, and we live in Michigan, which gets snow. And so we had about 3 weekends in a row of heavy snow. So the worst kind of snow is like in the spring where it's more wet. And out of nowhere, a whole bunch of trees came down. And we live on a dirt road, so you can imagine you got to get everything out. So we found a group of young people, enterprising young people who had chainsaws, and they were going to take stuff down, pay them cash, and it's all good. So they were taking everything down, and it worked really well. But there was one tree that was leaning over our conservatory, right? And it's a place that Stanley and I really enjoy being out there. And I said, the guy said, you want me to cut it down? This tree's going to fall down. Well, if I had been thinking about it, I would have said, no, can you shimmy up the tree and get the snow out of it? And, but I let the guy cut the tree down. And the minute he did it, I just had this horrible feeling. I don't know if you've ever had this happen where, and then what you do is you mire, you ruminate. Why did I let this happen? This is not, I made a really bad snap decision. And so what I started thinking about was the paradox. What was the paradox? Paradox, I love trees. And I let this guy cut a tree down. The paradox is I'm a thoughtful person, but I wasn't thoughtful, right? The paradox was I have to check the software here. Something didn't go right. Well, then I had to look at the meaning. Why did I let this happen? Well, I think, was it because I was panicked about this? Was it because I've deferred this? Was I having a bad day? Was I tired? Maybe and you go through all the kind of things that you do. And part of the reason I think it was is I didn't give myself enough time to think this through. I didn't give myself 5 minutes to just step back and say, we're just cutting down trees because, one's across the road. And those were easy decisions to make. And it didn't occur to me that this fell in a different category. Right. So then the next part was, well, what's the guiding principle? The guiding principle is whenever you have something that seems like a snap decision, be present of mind to give yourself 5 minutes and maybe call Staney and say, what should I do here? Doesn't mean I always do what she says, but mostly I do. But it means I'm beginning to think about it. Then I'd run an experiment. So to your listener, what I would say, and then what happened was we had a situation with a car that kind of broke down, and we had people take advantage of you when that happens. And we kind of thought through, I kind of got to think through 5 minutes. What are some alternatives to what these experts are telling me? We had a very positive experience. So here's what I'd ask your listeners to do. I'd like you to think about a decision that you made recently that you actually don't know why you made it, right? I have no idea. This came out of nowhere. This is not like me. You said something at a party that was hurtful. This is something that just didn't fit. Then I want you to think about, that's the paradox. Then I want you to think about, what does this mean? Why did I do that? Right? Which we all do. But don't get on one thing. The object is to fan out. 15 things of why I might have done that. And then you sort of work it like you're workshopping it. You're workshopping it. You maybe talk to a confidant or go for a long constitutional. Think about that. Why you do that. She laughs because I go on constitutionals every day. Why am I doing this? Then this is what Benjamin Franklin did. He was great at this. Then make a simple rule. What the learning? Given all this, what's the learning? Put it on a laminate. I do that all the time. Get a tattoo. I don't know. Just remember it. And then the next time that you're in then to test it, run an experiment. Is this true that I would do this, or try it? And what you're going to find is in the first iteration, it's not quite right. Almost never. The first pancake is never a good pancake, right? So second one's the second one's considerably better, and the third one's a good pancake, right? So you don't have to go through endless loops of this, but that's what I would ask people to do. And I'd start with yourself and the paradoxes about why did I do this?
I love it. The first attempt is learning. That's a nice acronym for fail. First attempt is learning. I loved our series. I have a little quote that I just wanted to share before I come to you guys to ask you where people can find you, etc. Also, maybe you call out your final message to the audience, because it'll be a while before we connect again, because before you write your next book as well. I really enjoyed this one. I really enjoyed this episode because we put everything together as well. There's a part from the book. I had so many little quotes and I've been sharing them on LinkedIn, as you probably saw, but I love this one. You said, transformation begins within. By first changing ourselves as individuals and leaders, we unlock the potential to transform our teams and our organizations. Through your personal growth, you can inspire a thriving organizational culture, elevate competencies, and foster a vibrant community. As visionary leaders, you embody the culture, practices, and competencies you aspire to see. In essence, you lead by example, guiding those around you to embrace and champion change. I love that. That's my mic drop from me. Maybe I'll come to you, Staney. Ladies first, what's your final message to our audience?
It's messy. innovation and change and creativity is really, really messy. So you have to have a stout heart, right? And a will. You need to know what you're getting into. You're going to get pushback. But, that's how it is. And if you want to be a real change maker, you're going to have to accept all of that. So surround yourself with community and people who can support that.
As you said, it's table stakes to do that, right? So, Jeff, firstly, before you give your final word, where's the best place to find you?
JeffDeGraff.com. And there's a ton of free stuff on there. So my school of thought and all that's there. And I'm one of the original LinkedIn influencers. So if you look me up on LinkedIn, you can find me. And I post a lot of articles and stuff that I write for, you don't have to look at all the publications. You'll find them if I put them on LinkedIn. I would say the last thing is about 40 years ago, I coined a term called creativizing. In fact, I trademarked it, right? I coined the term meaning just add creativity to everyday normal things. Let's take this down 1,000, right? The object is what you're really trying to do is get momentum. You're trying to get movement. You're trying to become more fluid at something. So rather than making this grand, let's make this intimate, right? So whether it's doing something creative in the way you drive to work or the way in which you have a coffee conversation with a friend. And what's going to happen is that's going to build muscle memory. It's going to build momentum. And the object of that is once you start living in that mode where you're able to affect some agency within yourself and some agency around you, that's when everything starts to change. It all starts with you creativizing.
And by the way, you can get started. Just sign up to our Substack. I have a copy of this bad boy up for grabs as well. But this was the book we're covering today, The Art of Change, their latest in the tome of work of the DeGraffs. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Authors of The Innovation Code, The Creative Mindset, and the finale in our trilogy, The Art of Change. Jeff and Staney DeGraff, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Aidan. We've really enjoyed this.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Double mic drop. Thanks once again to our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find out more about Kyndryl and the Kyndryl Institute at kyndryl.com. Don't forget, you can win a copy of this book, The Creative Mindset. Just sign up to our Substack. Just watch out for posts and I'll ask you to respond and you will be in the hat to win a copy of that. And the book we covered today was The Art of Change, the finale in the trilogy of the DeGraff series. Thanks for joining us.